Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday on my channel, I'll talk about a certain graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week we have a certain comic book subject. If you've seen the title of this video, you would, think that the subject I'm talking about today is ridiculous, because the question I ask in the title of my video, did Stan Lee ruin comic books, is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous question. So you might wonder, well, of course not. Why are you even asking that question? There is a reason. There is a reason for the title of this video. There is a reason I'm talking about this. Because yes, on the face of it, it seems ridiculous. No, spoiler alert, no. Stan Lee did not ruin comic books. He did create some of the greatest comic books that have ever existed, and they are still fantastic comic books. He created, along with Jack Kirby and some other great artists, some of the greatest comic book characters in existence. So why on earth would I even ask, did Stan Lee ruin comic books? Well, the reason I ask is because every week I do these videos along with Steve Donoghue. We both have our Epic Comic Book Wednesdays. We'll talk about comic books. Frequently we disagree. I like a lot more comic books than Steve Donoghue does. And Steve Donoghue has often made the claim that Stan Lee ruined superheroes and comic books, or something to that effect. And he has a reason for saying this. And Steve Donoghue, in case you are not aware, I'll put a picture of him up here. He's wearing his mask in this picture. Trust me, it's better that way. So Steve Donoghue is a book critic. He's a professional book critic, a professional editor. So he's read every book pretty much that's ever been written almost. Smart guy. So you can't just dismiss what he's saying out of hand. I mean, I can, but you probably shouldn't. He's got a reason for saying what he says about Stan Lee. Here's the thing. Stan Lee did change comic books when he created the Marvel characters in the Marvel Universe. At this point, it was the Silver Age of comic books, which was heralded by the Flash, the character of the Flash over at DC Comics. For a long time, the only superhero comic books that were around were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and that was it for a long time. The Silver Age of comics brought back superheroes over at DC Comics, where you had the reimagined Flash and the reimagined Green Lantern and a bunch of other superheroes that started showing up over at DC. And then the Justice League was created, and the Justice League was a big hit. And DC's style of comic books was a style that Steve Donoghue enjoyed. He liked the DC superheroes the way that they were. He liked comic books the way that they were. He has claimed, and the reason I'm even talking about this is because of a couple of things he said in the last Epic Comic Book Wednesdays video that we did, which was on Spider-Man last week, where we were talking about the death of Gwen Stacy, which was a kind of an earth-shaking event back in the early 70s. And it heralded a change in comic books. Things like that just did not happen up to that point. And he mentioned that comic books are a static medium, and they should be a static medium. Steve Donoghue thinks comic books should be a certain way because that's the way he likes them. So the DC superheroes and the superhero comic books, they were very inventive. The Silver Age at DC was an incredibly creative time, and one of the reasons they were so creative in their stories is that they had some severe restrictions that were placed on what you could have in those stories. You couldn't have anything too violent. The superheroes all had to be very, very heroic, just straight-laced, super heroic good guys. Even Batman, their darkest character, was just really a good guy. And so you saw this in the Justice League, which was a great comic book. It's one of my favorite comic books, was the Justice League from that era when Gardner Fox was drawing it. You saw it then where you had these really creative, exciting adventures, each one self-contained every issue. But the superheroes did not have a ton of personality. Most of the personalities of the superheroes were pretty interchangeable, right? There wasn't too much difference between the way the Flash behaved and talked and the way that Superman behaved and talked in the Justice League comic book. They were all pretty bland. That's the way Steve Donoghue likes it. He thinks you should go in to a comic book, get what you're expecting from that comic book, which is a self-contained adventure where all the good guys are really good, all the bad guys are really bad. And at the end of the adventure, you're right back where you were at the beginning of the adventure. Everything has been taken care of. Status quo, we're back. Now, there is something to be said for that. But I imagine at the time, if you're most readers, not Steve Donoghue, but other readers, maybe you want a little something more. Maybe you want to read about characters that seem a little bit more realistic. And Stan Lee wanted that. So when Stan Lee was given a chance to create his own superhero team, because he was about to walk, he was ready to walk, he wanted to move on to other things. But he had a chance to make his own superhero team. And he went into it with the intention of, okay, if I was just going to walk anyway, I'm going to do this the way I want to, where I'm going to have characters that act like real people and exist in a world that obviously is not like our own. There are a bunch of aliens and superheroes in it and monsters, but it's a little closer to the world that we live in. So you have characters with real personalities, real conflicts, superheroes with feet of clay, which Steve Donoghue hates. He wanted to do that. And so he created one of the greatest comic books that has ever existed, and he created my favorite Marvel comic book, which is this one, the Fantastic Four. And it lives up to its name, the Fantastic Four, the world's greatest comic magazine. This is dynamite. It's incredibly fun. The characters are realistic and lovable and awesome, and it was amazing. And it changed everything in comics when this came out. It was a runaway hit, and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and a bunch of other great comic book creators had a chance to make some other great characters like Spider-Man and Thor and the Hulk and you know the Marvel Universe. It's kind of big right now. And all of these characters had unique personalities, incredibly creative stories for the most part. Yes, some of their plots were ridiculous. Let's face it, a lot of the plots over at DC Comics were pretty ridiculous too. But they were an awful lot of fun, and they were what readers wanted. Because think of, if you put yourself back in in that time, there was nothing else except DC Comics and some monster comics that Marvel was doing at the time. And here you finally have something different. A lot of comic readers who grew up reading Superman, Batman, and Superboy and the rest, they're growing up. They're getting a little older, but they still love the medium of comics. You finally had something different. You finally had, I wouldn't say they were adult stories because they weren't. They were not. But they were a bit more mature. They were interesting. You never knew exactly what was going to come because these comics were unpredictable. And they were a huge success. And this is what changed everything. And so we have a question. Was this change ultimately a good change, or did it lead to some bad things? It did eventually lead to some bad things. I think that superhero comics did take a turn for the worse. And I think that overall, they are not what they were, and that they've lost something. I think that is true. I do not lay the blame for this at Stan Lee's door, though, because Stan Lee he set out to create this specific thing in comic books. Comic books do not have to be one type of thing. Comic books, it's a medium where you can tell any type of story. You can tell any type of story. At one time, they did tell any type of story. Back in the 50s, when you had EC Comics, the greatest comic book company that ever existed, they told all kinds of different types of stories. War stories, romance stories, horror stories, science fiction stories. Every kind of story you can tell in comic books. Now all that came to a sad end, which comic book companies brought upon themselves. It wasn't Congress, it was themselves. When they self-censored themselves with the Comic Code Authority, strictly to get rid of EC Comics, the most popular and successful comic book company. That's a whole nother story. But it did lead to a stagnation in comic books. Stan Lee revitalized the medium, and he brought something different. And Marvel Comics are different than DC Comics. At least they were. And that was fine because it was a different thing. It was created to be a different thing. Marvel superhero comics were supposed to be a different thing. DC was doing their own thing. And that was fine. DC Comics was a different kind of comic book. There was a time when they were different things. And they should have stayed different things. DC could have gotten creative and made their comics more interesting, a bit more mature, while staying true to the characters and what made those characters great. They ended up not doing that over time. A big change came through the Bronze Age of comics, the 1970s, where you started having some darker themes over in Marvel Comics, the aforementioned death of Gwen Stacy. And sales at DC Comics started to suffer, and going into the 80s, their sales were not great. Marvel was the clear winner. Marvel had its own financial issues, but as for competing comic book companies, Marvel was the more popular company. Most people who were comic book readers preferred Marvel Comics. And so DC's answer to that came in the mid-80s, where a bunch of different things happened at the same time. For one thing, you had Crisis from DC Comics, which wiped out the continuity, which DC felt was too complicated and created a whole new continuity, a whole new beginning for their characters. It was very badly done. No matter what you think of this story, the story itself, the process was confusing. And so you didn't really know what really happened in DC continuity and what didn't happen. It was very confused. And they've had to sort out that confusion in continuity for years. But the bigger problem was that they consciously tried to make DC Comics more like Marvel Comics, which was a whole different thing. Also at that same time, Frank Miller, who did a fantastic job on Daredevil over at Marvel, came over and did The Dark Knight Returns, which was incredibly popular. Which was, if you're familiar with it, was an incredibly dark version of Batman. And he brought along Superman. Unfortunately, Frank Miller, when he brought in these characters, has no understanding of what Superman is all about and what makes Superman a great character. And really, to be honest, he didn't understand Batman as well as he thought he did either. But it was incredibly popular, this dark version of Batman. Also at the same time came Watchmen, Alan Moore's Watchmen, which was a 12-issue series, a graphic novel, which was a masterpiece. It was an incredible story, which took characters, superhero characters, independent superhero comic book characters, they weren't the DC characters, and told a story that was very realistic, very dark, and was like, okay, this is what would happen if superheroes existed in the real world. That was very popular. And it got to the point where DC decided, because of the popularity of this stuff, they were going to put that kind of thing in their regular DC comic books. They were going to make everything dark, and it's been incredibly dark over at DC ever since. And this was not a great change in the long run for comic books, I don't think. DC Comics, as they existed at one time, were not dark comics. They were the opposite of that. They were bright, they were hopeful, they were adventurous. Suddenly everything was dark. Suddenly you have sexual assaults happening all the time in DC Comics. And that is, I think, one of the reasons, it's just one, of where comics started to go wrong. It wasn't Stan Lee and Marvel's brand of comics. It was DC Comics' reaction to that, and how they used the popularity of some of the darker stories that came out in the 80s to change their comic book companies, to the point where you end up having stories like this story, Identity Crisis, which tries to take all of the dark stuff you saw in Watchmen and tries to put it in the regular DC Comics universe. Now, at the point this came out, DC was already super dark. You already had The Killing Joke, for example, written by Alan Moore, and Alan Moore has since disowned it because he says himself it was too violent for a Batman story. And so eventually you have this, more sexual assaults, superheroes acting all shady. I don't like that story very much. And that kind of thing, that's one of the things, I think, where comics went wrong. Because it took these characters and it just flipped them from what they were conceived to be. So at DC Comics, you have things like Green Lantern, Hal Jordan, becoming a serial killer, basically, and massacring a bunch of other Green Lanterns. Now, all of that was retconned, of course, which brings us to the other thing that has gone wrong with comics. To chase sales, comic books have gone all in on gimmicks and events. Big gimmicks, big events, and both companies have done that. Instead of going about it the proper way and just writing really, really good stories that make you want to keep reading the comic book, they'll go in for these big events and gimmicks over and over and over and over again until you just get sick of them and none of the stories have any stakes. For example, over at Marvel, for a long time, they were killing a major character every 3 months. They were literally doing that. They killed Captain America, they killed Spider-Man, they killed Wolverine. They'll kill everybody because they get a temporary boost in sales. And they can always bring that character back later because they can. Over in DC, they're doing the same kind of thing. They killed Superman. They have these big monster events where all these catastrophic things happen. And because they're always retconning things over at DC, no matter what happens there, it will be undone. Like recently when Superman revealed his secret identity. You know that's going to be undone as soon as it happens. So there are no consequences. There are no stakes. There's not a lot of interest. Now, whenever something major happens in comic books, I don't even pay attention. Because you know eventually it's just going to be undone and the story has no stakes no matter what the story is. Recently at both Marvel and DC, they've been doing a thing where they've been replacing their legacy characters with new versions of themselves. Different characters being those characters. That's something they've been doing too. Eventually all of that will be undone. You've got Superman's son being Superman. Eventually Clark Kent will be back as Superman. You know that. You know eventually it would happen. That is where comic books have gone wrong. Where since these comic books are owned by corporations that just want money, the editors don't even care at this point about their characters. It's all about the money. And so any way they can get cash, any event, they use the characters for that. They're not trying to do it just by telling excellent stories and staying true to their characters, because those characters had value. And for a long time at DC Comics, for example, you couldn't change these characters up too much. You had to keep them the way they were because there was value in that. Long-term value in keeping their characters consistent, keeping their ideals consistent, keeping the core of what their comic book characters and what their comic books were about consistent. There was value in that. And that's gone out the window. So is that Stan Lee's fault? Because he opened the door to a different kind of comic books with Marvel Comics? I don't think so. You had to figure that if this medium was going to survive, it couldn't continue the way it was. Eventually, people were going to get tired of just reading about the same kind of thing over and over and over again. Steve Donoghue wouldn't. He'd have been happy to read about the same things over and over again. But for everybody else, apparently, everybody else wanted something different, which is why Marvel was so successful. It was so successful for a reason. The stories were great. They were creative. You could say, in a way, that Stan Lee saved comic books. I'm kind of more in that camp. So anyway, I've gone on long enough. Steve Donoghue is going to make a video later where he tells me how wrong I am. So be sure to check that out. I'll link Steve Donoghue's channel down below. And I guess that's all I have to say this week. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.